In this next video, I want to talk about contemporaneous historians that have referred to Christ or have talked about the life of Christ. And most folks, when they talk about whether or not Jesus actually lived, whether or not he actually, walked around and did the sorts of things that the gospel writers claim that he did, few folks really know that he didn't do this, in a historical vacuum. Few folks know that there were many historians who recognized who Christ was, and they did not have a dog in the fight. They were not Christian people trying to convince people, and most of the historians that record the events of Christ did not believe in Christ. So I think if we are talking about evidence for whether or not the Gospels are an historical record, we need to have the confirmation of other historians. And it would, in fact, be very unusual if historians in those days did not mention Jesus, since the Christians ended up taking over the Roman Empire. And since in those days historians were everywhere, and there are lots and lots of documents about early Roman history, and so it would be very unusual if the life of Christ, if the existence of Christ, if the ministry of Christ was not noticed by professional historians at the time and commented on. And there are quite a few of them. And fortunately, because we have the computer machine, it is easy to look up all of them. I looked up a few of them. I will mention a few of them. But if nothing else, if I get folks to do their own research, well then, this will be a much shorter endeavor than it needs to be. So there was a man named Tacitus who was a famous Roman historian, and in Christian era, CE, or AD, as the Catholics, separated out history in the Middle Ages. In 116 AD, or Christian era, he says this, and again, remember, Christ died in the early 30s. Most of the New Testament was written before 70 AD, so 30, 40 years after his death. And in the early 2nd century, a famous Roman historian says this. He says, "Neither human effort nor the emperor's generosity nor the placating of the gods ended the scandalous belief that the fire had been ordered by Nero. Therefore, to put down the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits, in most unusual ways, those hated for their shameless practices, whom the crowd called Christians." And then he comments that it was after Christ, or Christus in Latin, and had spread during the time of Tiberius, and said that Christ had been killed by the procurator Pontius Pilate, and that the Christians were oppressed at the time for the deadly superstitions that were spreading throughout Judea, which he considered to be evil. And they were guilty of all things horrible and shameful. And all of this, much to his chagrin, had become very popular in the empire. So a famous Roman historian confirms the fact that Christ lived, that Christ was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and he thought that the whole stuff was evil and horrible. And then you come to Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian, and he was actually a Jewish general. And he lived, I don't know, he was born probably about the time that Christ died. And he was not a Christian. And he was actually a Jewish traitor when the Romans came in to try to completely destroy the nation of Israel in the early 60s. He was a general in northern Israel who waved the white flag and talked his conquerors into using him as a translator. So he hung out with the Jewish generals who were conquering the rest of Israel. And when it came to Jerusalem, which was besieged by the Romans beginning in 66 AD, and then finally completely destroyed in 70 AD, he was there for all of it. But he writes about Jesus, and he said that the Sanhedrin was responsible for killing the brother of Jesus, who's called James, and killing some of Jesus' disciples. And then he goes on to say, and we learn that Jesus was conceived out of wedlock. So, because of, reports of Joseph not being his biological father, there was a lot of, he's a bastard talk. And he gathered disciples. He made blasphemous claims about himself. He worked miracles, but these miracles were not of God. They were of sorcery. And so here you have another famous early historian, although Jewish, who makes the claims that the Gospels say, but he doesn't believe them. He thinks he's an evil man. He doesn't think other people should believe him. And he doesn't discount the miracles, but he says, well, they were done by sorcery. Again, Josephus writes in his history called Antiquities about Jesus. He says, at this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his followers. And then he says, Pilate condemned him, but those of his disciples did not abandon him. And they reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion. And they said that it was in accordance with Jewish scriptures and in accordance with the Jewish prophets. And so, because it sounds so pro-Jesus, that is, it sounds very different than his description of this evil sorcerer conning all of Israel, all of the Jewish nation. Many folks look at that and say, well, now it's probably a insertion by pro-Christ folks, and he's just way too flattery. So maybe, don't know, you can take some of the flattery out of it if you want to, but you are still left with a record of a man who folks believed was special or miraculous and who died, and a record of his disciples saying that he rose again on the third day. Now, Josephus isn't saying that he actually did, which if the Christians had done insertions into his history, they may have said that. But he wasn't saying that. He said this is what they claimed. And so once again, you have that very, not only non-Christian, but anti-Christian witness. You had a man named Lucian of Samosata in the early 100s. So again, it's not that far away from the life and death and resurrection of Christ as the Gospels portray it. And he is writing a letter to his son. And he's talking about what he has heard about Jesus. And he says it was then that he learned the marvelous wisdom of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine. And what else, in short order, he made them look like children. And so he is talking about this man that he knows who is telling him about Jesus. So we're getting secondhand accounts, but this is what he heard about Jesus in the early 100s. And he's sharing with his son. And he says, for he was a prophet, a cult leader, head of the congregation and everything, all by himself. He interpreted and explained some of the books of Scripture and wrote many himself. They revered him as a god, used him as a lawgiver, and set him down as a protector. And then he goes on to say, and having convinced themselves that he was in fact immortal and lived forever, the poor wretches despised death, and they were even willing to give themselves up. Furthermore, their first lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another, and once and for all they ended up denying the Greek gods. And so he's critical of these people. He is saying, these poor wretches believe the truth about his resurrection. These poor wretches believe the truth that he is God. These poor wretches are willing to give up their lives in order to do this. All of the events that are recorded in the gospel are confirmed in the contemporaneous writings, many contemporaneous writings. Celsus, who was a Platonist philosopher, wrote during the early 100s, said that Jesus was a magician who made exorbitant claims. Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor and friend of Tacitus, the historian who we just talked about, wrote about the early Christian Church of Christ as to a god. Serapion, who was writing 73 AD, claimed that Jesus was a wise king, compares him to Socrates and Pythagoras, and that the destruction of Jerusalem 3 years earlier was God's revenge for them killing this man. And so those are just a few examples. And as I said, it is easy enough to, do the research these days. But all of that to say that these writers, who were for the most part anti-Christian and incredibly critical, and wrote within 30, 40, 60 years of the life and death and resurrection of Christ and the claims in the Gospels, all say that conclude that Jesus was a real man who lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar, that he was crucified in Palestine while Pontius Pilate was the local Roman ruler. He was crucified. He had a brother named James. His disciples believed that he rose from the dead and were willing to die for that belief. And the Christians were persecuted by Rome. And of course, none of that is an historical secret. I don't know of anybody, any ancient historian or current historian, that will say things like Christians thrown to the lions was a myth or a legend or a lie that was perpetrated by the church in order to make people feel bad for them. And there is a lot of evidence of how quickly Christianity spread and overtook the entire Roman Empire. And so in order for us to be critical of the accounts of the Gospels, we really need to take into consideration the revolutionary impact of the life of Christ that they describe on the Roman Empire, and how quickly it completely turned the world around. And some of the more common explanations, like the disciples hid the body, or the disciples just made this up, none of it holds water when you consider the historical impact of the claims of Christ that are recorded in the gospel, that his disciples clearly had known the truth about. He either appeared to them 3 days after he was killed, or he didn't. And if he didn't, then you have to account for the fact that all of his disciples died a horrible, miserable death because of their claims of this. And what I'm saying is his immediate disciples. But then you add to that the millions of Christians just shortly after his death and supposed resurrection were willing to give up their lives for that belief. So what I would like to do in the next video is just give a brief summary of the series and where we have been, and then just leave it at that. So thank you very much.